All right, welcome everyone. Again, thank you so much for joining us today for this live conversation. We are going to work you through some resources that hopefully will be able to help tell some really great stories in our local communities. So as a reminder, today's conversation is part of Reporting on Addiction's work to help journalists cover, the billions of dollars that are coming into our communities right now as the result of the settlements from the opioid litigation. And I know that we probably have folks on this call who are journalists, and we have folks on this call who are not journalists. So just as a reminder, the focus of today's conversation is to support journalists who are covering this topic, who are doing this complex reporting in their local communities. But for the folks who are not journalists, it's still really important for you to be involved in these conversations. So I hope that you will take the resources that you see here today. We'll share a recording after the fact and share those things with journalists in your communities to help them tell these stories. A quick reminder that September is National Recovery Month and International Overdose Awareness Day is August 31st. So if you're a journalist and you're thinking about news hooks for kind of some of this reporting, those are two great news hooks that are coming up for you. So I'm going to introduce our guests and let's go ahead and get started. So first we have Kate, who is a senior legal technical advisor at Vital Strategies in the Overdose Prevention Program. And Christine is a visiting scholar at the Yale Law School's Solomon Center. She's also the founder of the Opioid Settlement Tracker.com. And if you attended our first conversation with Aneri Patani earlier I think it was in May, Aneri and Christine worked on some of these things together. Kate worked on some of the resources that we're going to be sharing today. But Aneri talked through specifically how to use Christine's resource. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about that resource and then add on some additional things that are available for you to use. So let's go ahead and jump in. This is going to be a 30-minute conversation, and we are going to cap it at 30 minutes because we know that as journalists, you only have so much time. So we're going to start really just with kind of a very basic primer. Christine, Kate, whoever wants to take this one, let's kind of just get a baseline set. What are these settlements? What are the opioid settlements? Where is this money coming from, and where is it going to?
I'll take that first, Kate. If I miss anything, jump in, please. And is my audio okay? I'm audible. That's great. Audibility is great. So I'm thank you so much for the kind introduction. I got into the space by launching opioidsettlementtracker.com. It still tracks opioid settlements, which, when we're talking about opioid settlements and when we see the millions of dollars being reported on in the news by all of you, and then also the state's AG's press offices issuing their press releases, it's talking about a semi-specific thing. These are settlements reached between pharmaceutical companies and state and local governments. The money that's going to individuals, right? Like the Purdue Pharma individual claimant stuff, also endo, that by my last estimation is less than 1% to 2% of the, 50 plus billions of dollars that we have on the table. So I want to make that very clear. This is, when we're talking about opioid settlements, it's basically a financial transfer from US pharmaceutical corporations to the state and local governments to abate future opioid crises. And the monies that are going to folks who have lost their son or daughter to OUD, and the folks who have filed individual claims in Purdue and Endo's proceedings, that money is not usually what we're talking about, which is the utter travesty and the reason why these settlements should be spent well. As a technical note, on my website, the Global Settlement Tracker tab, that spreadsheet has been updated to include a lot more companies. I know a lot is kind of a subjective term, but now it includes McKinsey, the manufacturers that are in bankruptcy, Purdue, Mallinckrodt, Endo, the manufacturers that are not, Teva Allergan, the big three distributors, and the big three pharmacies. And each of the cells, the amounts linked to AG press releases, so you don't have to go Googling for them. They're all there for you.
So we have, and we're going to get a better look at your website and how journalists can use your website. But I want to shift and talk about these state level guides that you and Kate have been working on. So Kate, can I maybe ask you to start with this one? What are these state level guides? Why did you create these things to be looked at a state level when we know this is affecting national communities nationally?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much for the opportunity to participate today. So, Vital Strategies and opioidsettlementtracker.com, Christine, partnered to release what are essentially encyclopedic resources for every US state and the District of Columbia, capturing critical information such as how much money is a state getting, and how is that divvied up between a state and local governments? Who makes decisions about how settlement spending will occur at the state and local levels? Is there an advisory structure, such as a council or a committee, and who is on it? And what kind of expertise is represented by those participating in it? Does a state have additional parameters or requirements on spending beyond what we see in Exhibit E of the national settlement and the various permitted uses? And for someone who's interested in tracking funds or participating in the process as an interested stakeholder or a journalist or whomever, how do you do that? What are the specific and concrete forums in which you can do that? So each guide captures this information at the state level. And an initial objective was really to empower community participation, because we've seen such a great. You're muted, Ashton.
I'm going to try to mute those participants. You keep going. Sorry for the interruption.
All good. So yeah, an initial impetus was really to empower community participation, because so much of the content out there is geared towards a government or policymaking audience. But I have to add that the usefulness of the guides is much broader than that, because they really are an authoritative explanation on governing law and legal instruments in every state. You know, these complex allocation agreements, MOUs, state statute, and really parse that information for any audience, including journalists, and so are a great resource in this space as well.
Yeah.
And if I could add to that, oh, sorry, Ashton.
No,
thank you very much.
Excellent.
This will be very quick. When a state is articulating how it plans to spend its millions, it does so in a bunch of different ways. Y'all have seen the state subdivision agreements or the MOUs, and there are also statutes, and then sometimes things come out in a letter from the AG's office to the legislature, whatever. We have collected all of those things and summarized all of those things, and they all live in the guides. So these guides, I would never recommend, like, you don't have to read the state subdivision agreement. Don't read the state's actual plan. Rely on the guides. I would never say that. But what I will say is that if you just want to wrap your head around a state's approach to opioid settlement spend in the most convenient way possible, and ideally via PDF, these guides are for you. And these guides, each of the rules that are listed also cite to the specific areas of the statutes and the MOUs where the state is actually making a promise to do something or to not do something. So it's meant to be a time-saving exercise. And for what it's worth, these guides kind of preempt a lot of my work. It kind of puts me out of business because some of the consulting I do is so state-specific, right? And so it really captures like whatever I would do for state-specific consulting for anyone as well. So they're incredibly useful in that way.
Yeah, why don't we jump in? Christine, if you want to share your screen, can you start, or maybe Kate's ready to do this. Can you show us where we can find these guides, and maybe give us an overview, an example of one and how to use it?
Yeah, I'll let Kate take this one unless I have
Sure.
my screen up. The guides themselves are hosted on Vital Strategies website, but we have cross-promoted or, cross-posted them. They also live under my settlement spending tab on opioidsettlementtracker.com. But Kate, feel free to take away if you have the PDFs up. Otherwise, I'm happy to jump into it.
Sure. And I just put in the chat where you can find the resources on Vital Strategies site. And
while you're sharing, I'll just say that we're also going to collect all of these links and email them out to everybody who is here today, so you can quickly access. There's a lot of information being shared in the chat. We will reshare that out with you along with a recording of today's conversation.
Right, just pulling up the correct. Folks are seeing this?
Yes.
Great. So this is the state of Kentucky, and we can just sort of quickly walk through the major sections of this guide. And so you'll see what is covered, and the other state resources are structured analogously and can contain the same sort of level of detail. But you can see the sort of big picture takeaways up top around amount of funding coming to a given state, how it is divided funding between the state and the localities, and then the sort of legal mechanisms that govern that process. And so everything is linked so that you can find the primary source should you want to do a closer sort of examination. And then we have a sort of high-level overview of how the state has approached the allocation and use of its funds. Where there's an advisory structure and sort of its role. You can see here a further breakdown of each respective share and how that money will be spent in terms of decision-making and any particular sort of substantive requirements on how the money is spent. And in Kentucky's case, Kentucky is unique in that its state law is quite detailed in outlining permitted uses above and beyond what you see in Exhibit E of the National Settlement. And so, that is covered here as well. And where, there's a grant-making role for this kind of body, we outline that as well, which we did here. The criteria that the state commission will consider in its awarding of funds, and the sort of procedural dimensions of all of this, where localities are required to report on what it is they're doing or certify that they've used the funds appropriately. We outline that here. The composition of this advisory commission and its sort of mandate. We outline the process for allocation of and spending of local shares. So oftentimes this will just be the sort of standard decision-making and appropriation process that you observe at the local level. Some states have more detailed requirements in place, but we try to include a local example as well where we can. Here, and critical for this discussion is tracking funds. So what is in place for a journalist or anyone else to monitor where the money is going? Is it being spent wisely at the state and local levels, and how to, monitor that process? Where there are procedures for enforcement, we outline that. So where there is spending on an unauthorized use or something that doesn't constitute opioid remediation, how is that accounted for? Are there any sort of remedies available? And then a sort of list of specific opportunities to engage in the process. So are there structured opportunities for public input, listening sessions and the like? Where can you find minutes of the meetings of this commission? And so That's all outlined in addition to state-specific resources. So this includes, of course, settlement-specific resources, but also where there may be useful data or epidemiological resources on the sort of state of the overdose crisis in a given jurisdiction. You can find that here. And then the detailed citations so that you can kind of do a deep dive there as well. So I'll leave it at that unless you wanted to add anything, Christine.
Excellent. No,
Yeah,
that's perfect.
incredibly detailed resources. And I know that we've said this multiple times, but I just want to reiterate that every state process is different. And that's why you all have done this really hard work of individualizing it state by state. Kentucky was an example of a place where it looked like there was legislation that had been passed to kind of oversee this process, but there are some states where that's not the case. So that's why it's so important for journalists to be doing this work. Christine, maybe for some people on the call, these guides, these state-by-state guides are new information to them, but they certainly aren't new. And I was wondering if you could talk us through an example of a story that has come from or resulted from the work of either the opioidsettlementtracker.com or one of these state-by-state guides that you all have put together.
Yeah, it's been awesome. I mean, it's always so great to like see these guides linked to, right? Because it's like, oh, our babies are out there. So I'll stick to a specific type of example. Examples I've noticed of the guides appearing in articles. So there are three examples I have for you today. I can drop the links in the chat or whoever. The first, there was a Boston Globe mention of these guides. Quite exciting. They link to the guides, everything. I enjoy I almost said an expletive. I truly enjoy speaking to journalists. This is like the deepest expression of my values in this work, right? Because we want to create information parity. We want to raise all ships. We want, we don't want very important plans to be obfuscated by the legalese. And so much of my tracking work rests on everyone's shoulders in this room. Like without the Google alerts that are generated by, these local story hits and all of that, like without those, I couldn't be doing my work. So just first of all, thank you to everyone out there. I admire your profession, your craft, and I certainly stand on its shoulders. So the Boston Globe cited to our guides, and I don't know if, thank you, Jonathan. The way that this reporter reached out, and I should say that it's not like, I don't need like a lure in like the reach out or whatnot, but the thing that attracts me to take certain interviews versus not is when I can kind of see where a reporter is in their research process. It's like, I've done this, I've done that. Now I'm really curious about this and I keep scratching my head. Can you help me out? Like that is the thing that I find quite enticing because it's like, yes, I would love to like, de-headache this process. So the way that Lynn had reached out, I think it was Lynn who wrote the Boston Globe piece. She mentioned that she was working on a story about the opioid settlement monies, as all of you are, and that she's focusing on the municipalities. She wants to put the story in a national context, and she welcomes my thoughts about the broader issues concerning transparency. It's like this was like form written to like get my interest or something. I mean, you can see where she's at in the research, what questions remain, and I can kind of see like the path of like her own discovery of this process. And I just find that so intriguing. So as much detail as a person can convey in the email, like this is where I'm at, like understanding this. Like I love that because then I can be the most effective. The next example comes out of Rhode Island, the Public's radio. The way that this health reporter reached out to me, after the introduction, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. I've learned from your settlement tracker and I've confirmed with my AG's office that there are no explicit reporting requirements. So far, the state has distributed X amount of monies and it's been like pulling teeth to figure out what's going on. Can you help me out? Also kind of in the same like emotional format of things. It's like, I'm here, like, please. And there, I pointed to, as with the Boston Globe article, I pointed to the guides to see, listen, like this will answer a lot of your questions, like check this out. And it came as a relief, which was obviously like super satisfying to feel, right? The third and final example I'll mention today comes out of Pennsylvania. It's a WHYY or Y, which is an NPR PBS joint, like affiliated outputs. That article, thank you very much for dropping that in the chat. The way that this reporter reached out, I'm working on a story about Delaware County, very specific, right? I'm trying to figure out how this county is going to spend its monies. This county was the first in the state to sue, gave me a little bit of history of this particular county. News to me. I'm like, thank you for that. I'm reaching out because I want an idea of best practices on how counties should spend the money, particularly as it relates to blah, blah, blah. At this juncture, I knew I was going to talk to him anyway, but at this juncture, I would clarify that, my role in this is not to like have any like substantive input in like how the money should be spent, but procedural input, like should they be spent transparently? Yes. Should folks with lived experience be included at the decision-making table? Like, duh, absolutely. So I'll chime in on those things, but I'll point you to my friends if you want to hear about specific interventions, right? So just 3 examples. I don't want to take up more of that time, but real quick and dirty, the articles are in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. So what story ideas, I'll ask this question of both of you. Do you have story ideas that you can share with journalists? What should they be reporting on? What should they use the guides to report on? What ideas do you have to share with them? Kate, do you want to go first?
Sure. And yeah, to the point Christine just raised around some of the sort of procedural aspects of all of this and how to ensure an inclusive process with the right people sort of at the table. I think it would be interesting to examine the inclusion of people with lived and living experience in advisory structures. Some states might have a requirement in their governing mechanism that the needs of particular communities are considered in spending. So, for instance, in Massachusetts, its abatement terms require state and local governments to use funds in a way that integrates input from communities and people with lived experience and addresses health inequities in underserved communities. So, where a jurisdiction has that kind of requirement, what are they doing to see it realized? I also think it's quite interesting to consider how states and localities sort of are assessing needs. Is there a sort of systematic process or strategic planning process in order to do that? We want the funding, we don't want it to be used to supplant other kinds of spending that is already going towards overdose prevention and addressing this crisis. And so, what does that look like? And then kind of relatedly on the other end, does the state or locality have a process or plan to evaluate impact? So are these investments achieving their sort of intended aims or not? And what is the sort of course correction that is happening when they're not? So those are just a few ideas top of mind for me.
Fantastic. Christine, do you have other thoughts?
Yes, really concrete idea that I have. This is new. Like I relaunched my global settlement tracker spreadsheet to include more of the companies, right? Now it's a decent spread. It's a pretty good spread. So what the story idea is, you can be the first in many states. You can be the first reporter to sum up your state settlements from each of the defendants listed in my spreadsheet. What I mean by that is, this link was dropped in the chat earlier, but I'll drop. Oh, Jonathan, you preempted me. Yes, exactly that link. Thank you. So if you go to your state's row and you just tally up the sums of the reported amounts, from left to right, in some cases they won't be available, and I'll welcome your input if you come across concrete evidence of an amount where I include like a TBD or whatnot. But you can sum up, the totals in a row and say, oh, our state is receiving this exact amount of monies from these companies. And I don't see that done enough. And I really should be summing up these totals myself for each of the states. And in fact, I will be doing that because more granular tracking will be a part of my work with Yale Solomon Center as I'm a visiting scholar. So very exciting. So that's one idea, right? You can actually report your state's settlement sum, and you might be the first to do that in your state. The other thing I'll just quickly mention, and Kate touched upon this as well, but to articulate the need for good opioid settlement spend in a particular state, using like the moral argument that, yeah, we should be trying to maximize life safety, or what are we doing if we're not doing that? Like, of course we should be making that argument. But also it's kind of cool to like look into a state's individual history with big tobacco as well. You could kind of make the point in like a finance nerdy way as well. You can, underscore that moral point by saying, our state inevitably, because most states did, inevitably spent these tobacco monies terribly. Our state's plan addresses some of the gaps that the settlement, tobacco settlements missed, but it doesn't cover all the gaps. Therefore, here are the risks remaining for our state. I feel like that's very persuasive, and that's grounded in like historical data, and I love that, and I'd be happy to help you out. Just the two ideas.
Yeah, really wonderful ideas. We only have a couple of minutes left, and we said half an hour, so I'm going to stick to half an hour. But if anybody has a question they'd like to unmute and ask really quickly, you are welcome to do that. If you'd prefer to drop your question in the chat, please go ahead and do so, and I will actually just collect all of those written questions, and we'll follow up with answers to those in the email that we're going to send with the recording and all of the links for you today. But I'll hold space. We've got 2 minutes if anybody's got a really burning question they want to unmute and ask. So we've got one in the chat that says, I apologize, I'm blocking it. How should we navigate reporting on a state or municipality that doesn't require public reporting?
That's a very, very, very good question. I love this question so much. You can describe the negative space, right? Like describe the lack of reporting requirements as like a primary thing. But more often than not, some of the states have included like outcome reporting. They might not commit to report self-reporting exactly how much money is spent on whatever, but they'll do these annual reports where they'll describe settlement spend in general terms and say it was used by this department for this generally. We're not going to disclose the amount, but these were the uses of settlement funds. So um, there are states that have intrastate reporting requirements as well. I'll wrap up this point very quickly, but states that aren't required to publicly report how they're spending it, but they're required to report it upwards, either to the AG's office or the legislature. You can write an article saying, well, if you're collecting this data anyway, and if the localities are already reporting this, do a call for action, right? It's like, just make this public. Y'all already have the data, just make it public. I feel like that's persuasive.
Absolutely. Well, we've hit the top of the hour, so I'm going to quickly share with you all. We're going to be sharing out the links that came with you, the recording today, the links that came to you, excuse me, the recording of today's event, all with you. This QR code should take you to our website to sign up for our newsletter, where you'll receive all of this information. I want to say thank you again to Christine and Kate, both for your time today, but also for the immense amount of time you spent creating these resources, because they are going to be so pivotal, especially in small newsrooms that don't have the resources to just like, I'll just set aside 6 months and I'll only report on this topic. I know that that can't be done in most places. So thank you so, so much for your work. I'll stop the recording. I'm going to hang around and collect some more questions in the chat. So do feel free to type those in. But if you can't stick around,